Welcome back to this special show. We are discussing whether what has been proposed by way of changes to the Income Tax Amendment Act via the Finance Bill is harsher and more stringent than what is already in practice. Essentially, we're looking at the fine print. You would have read the headlines, tax terrorism, Inspector Raj, but is it really true? That is essentially what we are debating here. We've got views from many of our panelists, but Mr. H.P. Ranina hasn't spoken yet, so I will go across to him first, senior corporate lawyer. Thank you very much, sir. Would you also focus on the reasons given point, sir, that Mr. Kanabar was sort of alluding to earlier, and before that, Mr. Bhattacharya?
See, the important point to be noted is that the courts have taken a view that Income Tax Department has a right to rely on private sources of information. Now, this is a well-established principle of law. It has been set out for the last 30, 40 years. That department can rely on private sources of information. This means that the information has to remain private and confidential. Now, if the reasons are to be disclosed to the assessee himself, then nobody is going to come forward to give information. Let me tell you, Prashant, that I have known cases where family members have spoken against others. Fathers have spoken against sons, sons against fathers, husbands against wife, wife against husbands.
Right.
Brothers against brothers is more common. So that is why that information has to be sensitive and has to be kept confidential. And this is why this amendment has been brought about. And of course, it will be disclosed to the competent court when the matter goes on a writ or on a reference, or it goes to a high court, that will be disclosed. But at the initial stage, it cannot be disclosed because it is of a very sensitive and confidential nature.
Right.
Therefore, I think the government is quite justified in making this amendment. And I think what Mr. Saxena said is absolutely right. And I also agree with what Dinesh has mentioned, that this is something which even the courts have said that just because the reason is not disclosed, it doesn't mean that a search becomes invalid.
Have you, Mr. Ranina?
The other important point which I want you to note is that even if a search is...
Yeah, go on, sir, go on.
Even if a search is conducted, say out for invalid grounds, but if nothing is found, if a man is honest, if a taxpayer is completely honest, then there's nothing to worry about. The whole issue is that if tax assets have been found, evasion has been found as a result of the search, can the law turn a blind eye to such tax evasion on the technical ground that the reasons were invalid or were not properly recorded?
But I think that is...
so this is the real issue.
But there have been Supreme Court judgments which kind of have settled that issue, right? I mean, if you find unaccounted for wealth which cannot be explained by a regular source of income, and the reasons were invalid, I mean, that is still will be counted as illegal income, right? I mean, and can be appropriated by the department. I think that is,
of course
that
it
is
will
clear.
Be. And,
on the other 2 points,
consequences will follow.
Yeah,
absolutely.
On the other 2 points, very briefly, sir, in a minute, if you can quickly wrap up. Any thoughts on if you've gone through the amendments in the Finance Act, in terms of giving, vast powers to junior officers? The point being made that, it has to go through senior officers and it's now being diluted. Any thoughts on that? If you've gone through the actual wording of what's written in the Finance Act, yes.
No, on the search.
Yeah.
No, on the search, there is no change. That those powers have to be exercised by the top commissioners, only then it can be done. But it's only on power of gathering information that the powers is given to the junior officers. And this is found to be necessary because otherwise, you have to act immediately. Very often you have to act very fast. Therefore, if you go on taking permissions, it may not be able to be very effective. That is one point.
Right.
And on the issue of attachment, it is only provisional, and the assets will be released because otherwise it was found that taxpayers were trying to get rid of those assets as soon as they were found. And therefore, to avoid that, the provisional attachment provision is brought in.
Sure. So Mr. Ranina and Mr. Kanabar kind of sort of agree with what the government has done, that it was actually necessary, especially on the reasons given point. Mr. Bhattacharya, while we take the point that, theoretically what you say makes sense, that reasons have to be provided. Otherwise, I mean, what recourse does the SSE have without the reasons? I mean, if it has to go all the way to the High Court for him to find the reason, he's at a disadvantage. But is this a case of, as I said, from de facto to de jure? And can you accuse the government of being appropriating power with itself, or it's just a case of being kind of ham-handed? It was subtle in law, it's just been made explicit. Your reaction, sir?
language is that reasons recorded by the income tax authority shall not be disclosed to anyone, to any authority, or to the income tax appellate tribunal. I mean, in my experience, I have never come across such an unreasonable legislation on the part of the state. I mean, how can there be a legislative command that you shall not disclose, which you write
Mr. Bhattacharya, but that is the point
in the
I'm
file?
Mr. Bhattacharya, but that's the
now
point
the
I'm
question
making.
is-
That's the point I'm making. But, you know, a person in a
Yes.
top official
Yes,
in,
it can't be.
in investigations told me that go back the last 50 years, there will be only very few cases in which reasons have been shared. Reasons are not shared. So it has essentially been made explicit in the law, which was not part.
No, that is a, you
Yeah.
see, you see, when Parliament makes a law, I mean, you go by the constitutionality of it.
Sure, sure.
I'm not saying that this particular thing will be abused, it will not be abused. Now, prima facie and patently, this provision that Parliament is giving a command
Sure.
that you shall not disclose, you will impair the right of an assessee, and you will not disclose to the income tax authority, income tax appellate tribunal. That means you are rendering the entire income tax machinery totally ineffective. It is a one-sided.
Is this, Mr. Bhattacharya,
It is a state operation.
Yeah,
This is a state operation. This
Okay.
can lead to state operation at its worst.
Right. Mr. Bhattacharya, do you believe this will be challenged?
And retrospectively.
Do you believe this will be challenged in court? I think
Retrospective.
Yes.
Can I just
yes,
make this point?
Yes, we didn't get to that point. Yes.
No, I
Yes,
don't
can.
know. You see,
Sure.
you see, retrospectivity. We heard such a hue and cry about Vodafone, retrospective amendment. And this is retrospective amendment from 1961. You see, this kind of amendment.
Let me take that. Let me take that to Mr.
Vodafone, there
Kanabar.
was a tax.
Yeah, let me take that to Mr. Kanabar. Mr.
I mean,
Kanabar,
this is.
if
this
you would
is
like to very briefly,
totally
30 seconds, sir.
Double standard.
Talk about the
This is-
retrospective aspect, which Mr.
This
Bhattacharya
is
is
double
mentioning.
standard at its worst.
Mr. Kanabar, would you like to respond to that? The retrospective aspect.
So,
Yeah.
So two things. First, as Mr. Ranina pointed out, we have a Supreme Court judgment which was a bit vague, which was not dealing with this issue, where an obiter dicta on the availability of reasons during assessment proceeding was a subject matter of discussion. The reason why this is retrospective, and I abhor retrospective legislation, but in this case, it's a process thing and a procedural thing, clarifying that it was never the intention. So, in principle, I agree with Mr. Bhattacharya that one should not keep anything back. But the reasons are disclosed to the courts, and the courts, even after the amendment, have an inherent power to call for the reasons and look into the adequacy of the reasons. I don't think that is being taken away. But one different thing on which I would like to comment, Prashant, if I have a minute more.
Yeah, 30
which is with
seconds,
regard
30
to
seconds,
provisional
quickly, yes,
attachment.
yes.
And that is something I'm very much concerned about. Sure. So, on the provisional attachment, the proposition is that while a search is going on, even before ascertaining the liability of an SSE, you are provisionally attaching asset. And the concern there is a very simple one. One has seen in practice that in searches, people are coerced into making declarations, and this ability to make a provisional attachment can be abused. And I hope I am incorrect, but will be abused by coercing people to make declarations of unaccounted income. And I'm really worried about that one.
Mr. Saxena, last word to you, sir. I mean, I think you began by saying that a lot of this fear is out there because of demonetization, notices being sent out, the tax department now having the wherewithal, the software to track a lot of the money which has come in, which cannot be explained, and the tax department going after this stock of money, unaccounted for money, quite aggressively. Last word to you, sir.
Yeah. about you want to know my views about attachment?
Just some, if you can sum it up for us, sir.
Hello?
You know that I don't think anybody really trusts the tax department to exercise restraint. I mean, you know, they would utilize what is written in the Act to the fullest and exercise those powers to the fullest. That is the fear. Go on, sir.
No, but the tax department has its own story, thinks that many a times whatever it does is viewed with great suspicion. So there's a trust deficit, you can say, about the attachment. Mr. Kanabar was saying that everything would be attached, but suppose the SSE is showing 1 crore of stock, but in his books, but actually he has 10 crores of stock. So in such cases, the tax department would be justified in going in for attachment, because the excess stock, if it is not attached, and if the SSE disposes it off, then the tax department would not have any handle to recover the taxes which are due to it. So about this attachment also, probably it will not be exercised in all the cases, but in some deserving cases, such power has to be there to be exercised. And
the question is, can the exception be the rule? Yes, go on, sir. Please, quickly finish. Yes.
Probably.
Yeah.
But the apprehension that it would be misused in all cases is misplaced, because there's a machinery in the income tax department, and the section itself says that it has to be approved by very senior officers. So probably we have to see how the section goes into operation and what comes out of it, instead of prejudging it that it would be misused to get declarations. Even when declarations are there, the courts have held that if there is nothing to back the declaration, then the declaration should not be taken as such, and the assessment should be made only on the available evidence.
Mr. Saxena, thank you very much for joining us and explaining some of the nuances and, of course, putting forward the department's view. Appreciate you joining in. I'm completely out of time. Mr. Bhattacharya, thank you very much for coming on and putting forward your view. Mr. Ranina, thank you very much as always. Mr. Kanabar, appreciate you joining in on the show as well. We just, by the way, you know, barely scratched the surface, so as to speak. And we are not even talking about the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, which is causing a fair bit of upheaval as well. But that is for later. Thank you very much for watching. And thanks for being with us.